And finally, we get to our introduction slide. So first of all, as the presentations proceed, please use the Q&A box for any questions, and we will address them at the end. A recording of this webinar will be made available at cibs.org.au in the week to follow. And I'd now like to introduce our speakers. And in putting this together, we really thought about a panel of experts who really understand the circular economy. And the first of our experts is Paul Murfitt. He's a Director of Industry and Infrastructure with Sustainability Victoria, and he's going to talk about the role of the Victorian Government in accelerating the transition to a circular, climate-resilient economy. Our second speaker is Melissa Gaspari, and she is the Sustainability Lead for New South Wales and ACT at Aurecon, specialising in life cycle assessment and reducing the embodied carbon in the built environment. Melissa will speak about the embodied carbon associated with building services and the role which building services engineers can play in reducing embodied carbon. And finally, our last speaker is Monica Richter, is a Senior Manager of the Low Carbon Futures Programme for the World Wildlife Foundation Australia and Project Director of the Materials and Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance, MECLA. Monica will speak about the work of MECLA with over 100 member companies and organisations agreeing to collaborate to reduce the upfront carbon in the construction and infrastructure sectors to align with the Paris Agreement objectives and the principles of the circular economy. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'd like to invite Paul to give his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. I'll just share my screen. Okay, I hope that's good for everyone and you can see that.
It looks good, Paul. I can see it.
Excellent. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for inviting me along tonight. A great agenda, and really pleased to be with you tonight. As Jeff indicated, my name is Paul Murfitt. I'm the Director of Industry and Infrastructure at Sustainability Victoria. Sustainability Victoria, for those that aren't familiar with it, is a Victorian state government statutory authority, and we focus on two key pillars, circular economy and zero net carbon. And our mandate, I guess, revolves around those two pillars, and we work across behaviour change, education, data analysis, insights, infrastructure programs, market development, a whole range of functional areas targeted at those couple of objectives that I know we all share. So tonight I wanted to change my slide. There we go. Tonight I wanted to talk about circular economy from a Victorian government perspective, and in particular from the perspective of some of the programs that we're running out at Sustainability Victoria. Difficult to cover them all, but I wanted to give you a taste of some of the key ones that are targeted at circular economy outcomes. So I'll refer to the Victorian government policy. I'll talk about some of the programs that we're rolling out at Sustainability Victoria, and my focus will be, obviously, circular economy encompasses, you know, the range of materials and resources that we use in our economy and our community. Tonight I want to focus a bit more on the waste and resource recovery space and that sector. It's a very big focus at the moment, not just in Victoria, but nationally as well. So my focus will really be coming from that that side. Okay. So just to give you a bit of a sense of that sector and the sort of scale, I guess, of what we're trying to address here in Victoria from a circular economy perspective. This graphic looks at the materials flows from 2019-20 in terms of waste material, and that Sankey diagram on the left looks at the different sorts of waste materials and their destination, if you like. So, for example, if you follow that pink thick line through, there's 7.7 million tonnes of aggregates, masonry and soil generated as waste material per annum in Victoria. And you can see from that Sankey that a vast majority of that actually ends up being reprocessed for other purposes, while the remainder goes to landfill. If you pick another example, like plastics, for example, in plastics, we have about 0.6 of a megaton, so 600,000 tonnes of plastic generated each year. We only reprocess about 20% of that. The remainder, some goes to export, some the rest gets landfilled. So the figure on the right there sort of is trying to represent the gap that we have to close for certain materials. You can see, for example, the outside blue ring talks about metals. 91% of the metals that are generated as waste are recovered and reused, whereas textiles, right on the inner of that diagram, on the inner circle, only 14% of our textile waste is recovered at the moment. The rest goes to landfill. So each of those waste streams present quite different challenges for a circular economy. But there are sorry about the resolution on this side, but there are, products and uses coming out of those waste streams. Some of them are in infancy, but some are quite well evolved. For instance, the aggregates I talked about before are reused to a great extent in building and construction projects. Paper and card is reprocessed into other packaging and paper products. Other materials like plastics and glass and metals are reprocessed increasingly and made into more durable products, including things like appliances. And there has been a lot of activity around repurposing for public space use as well. Tyres is another key waste stream that we need to look seriously at in Victoria, and organic waste is a big focus, which is generally reprocessed into fertiliser products for agricultural industry, but the volume that we generate does need to have a purpose other than landfill. So quickly just about the policy, Recycling Victoria policy, which is our circular economy policy announced in Feb 2020. It says over 300 million in funding. In fact, it's closer now to about 500 million in funding. So it's a big investment from the Victorian government looking to transform the waste and recovery sector, waste and resource recovery sector. It's really focused on driving innovation into the sector so that we can generate an economy around the increased circularity, generating jobs, of course, and reducing emissions as well, and providing long-term policy certainty for industry to invest in. So this implementation of Recycling Victoria is currently in full swing. It's guided by some pretty challenging targets. One is to divert 80% of waste from landfill by 2030, and we have an interim target at 2025 for 72%. So at the moment, if you recall from the earlier slide, we're around the 69% mark of diversion. So there's a bit of work to do and lots of tonnes to divert. We also have a target in that policy about reducing the volume of organic material going to landfill by half by 2025, and looking to have 100% of households having access to that separate food and organics service. So the food organics and garden organics bin that's being rolled out at the moment across the state. Fundamentally, this is going to require a really quite significant transformation of our current way of thinking and our current linear economy as it's currently known. That notion of just taking the materials, using and throwing away is something that's certainly not sustainable. I think we all recognise that. But the circularity or regenerative economy is something that we need to be focused on, bringing innovation, looking at creating new business models and building a new economy around that. And I want to give you some examples tonight of how we're approaching that at SV. We use this graphic really to think about the transition to a new economy, and there's the different components of this circularity is the make component up the top there, where when we think about making things, they need to be designed to last, be repairable and recyclable. Then there's the use portion. We need to get more value out of the products that we create. Then the next portion is about recycling and recovering resources, and then pushing those resources back into the make phase. Obviously, we're going to have waste products still. There's a big focus on managing those wastes that are not able to be used for energy recovery, for example. Once those go to landfill, we need to manage those appropriately. I do want to just set a little bit more scene and then jump into some programs. The waste and resource recovery sector over the recent years has been subject to a lot of market shocks, particularly over the past 3 years. I'm sure you'd recall the collapse of major recycling and curbside sorting facilities in Victoria. In response to those and things like the fires of stockpiled materials, government announced overhaul of the whole recycling and curbside system. There's currently sort of variable market maturity in Victoria to process and reprocess things like mixed contaminated curbside materials such as paper, glass, some plastics, but this has been further challenged by global changes affecting the commodity market for mixed paper and plastics, resulting in a lot of cost increases for Victoria and for Australia. So there's a very challenging context within which the Recycling Victoria policy is being implemented. One of the key things that I'm sure you'd be aware of is that the government's introduced export bans on key materials. And from this year through to 2024, export bans will be placed around things like unreprocessed glass, wouldn't be able to be exported from the country. Mixed plastics, we've already had one ban introduced in July where unsorted plastic can't be exported to other countries. And next year there'll be further bans on other types of plastics. Whole use tyres at the end of this year, well, in a couple of weeks, won't be able to export tyres any longer. Then there's also unsorted paper and card from July 2024. So all of these bans will be in effect by 2024. And what that's doing is meaning that we need to be able to deal with those hundreds of thousands of tons of waste material onshore. Recycling Victoria looks to try to establish the capacity in our economy to be able to do that, but also to be able to establish the know-how and innovation to be able to turn those formerly waste streams into products that can generate demand and drive economic growth. One of the key, there's a range of programs that we're currently focusing on. But I won't talk to this slide in detail, but we certainly have the strategy on our website, which details the sorts of support programs we have for each of those components, like make, use, recycle, and managing hazardous waste generally. So if you're interested in a particular area of that circle, you're welcome to follow up or look on the website. What I do want to talk about, because it's quite a significant investment from the government, is the infrastructure package that we're rolling out through my group. We're doing that in partnership with the Commonwealth Government, funding that they're providing. So all in all, it's well over $100 million of investment in Victoria that we're currently deploying through different streams. We're looking at, and the focus is on really those materials that I outlined in the export ban and the previous slides about the priority materials that we need to focus on. Also a big focus on hazardous waste and also a focus on waste to energy, which in itself is an interesting conversation when it comes to circularity, whether waste to energy and how you shape waste to energy so that it can contribute to a circular economy and not just burn a problem. So I will talk a little bit about this infrastructure package that we're rolling out. This package is a key component of the Recycling Victoria policy, and we're targeting this particular $100 million to increase the capacity of our local industries to process the waste material rather than it going to landfill. For example, actually just last week, we announced another range of successful projects. And while the one in Dandenong that's about to be commenced isn't a major project, like in terms of its scale, but it's really targeting, as I said before, we're hardly recovering any textiles, and most of it is going to landfill or going exported overseas. And I'm sure you've seen the media around the issues and problems that that's creating for other countries. But so we're looking to get the capacity here locally to reprocess the textiles so that they can become things like acoustic wall panels, building insulation, and for reuse in things like furniture infills and mattresses, which is the focus of this particular grant that was announced last week. Others that were announced last week included the use of glass for different purposes. In the past, we've made grants for glass to be turned into a sand replacement for asphalting and concrete and those sorts of things. We're also keen to be able to create higher value uses for glass. So a focus on making sure that bottled glass can be turned back into bottles rather than being turned into asphalt, for example. But it's a growth. It's a journey to get those higher value outcomes. One of the other, so there's a big focus on infrastructure. Here next week, actually, we're announcing another range, or the week after, of investments in Victoria around increasing the processing capacity for things like plastics, glass, paper, tyres, textiles, and organics. In tandem with that, we realise that we need to be able to increase the marketability of the products made from recycled content. So our Markets Acceleration Program is around a $30 million investment in research and demonstration to strengthen the product quality, testing and trials to make sure that they're to scratch, establishing standards and specs for those, and supporting commercialisation activity. So we've got to be able to drive the demand once we create the reprocessing capacity. So we get the processed waste, and we need products that will use that processed waste, and we need the demand so that the economy picks up on those processed wastes. And one of the key initiatives as well that businesses might be interested in joining is the Circular Economy Business Innovation Centre. It's really trying to support, those leaders out there that can drive these new technologies and the creative solutions to the waste challenges right across that circle, from the design phase to the reprocessing phase, right through to the creation of new products and services. So CIBSE, as it's known, the Circular Economy Business Innovation Centre, runs out a series of events, best practice highlighting, and also provides a range of funding opportunities. So it might be something that people are interested in. And just finally, I wanted to give you a sense of where our investment is going in terms of, this change graph here shows that over from 2016 out to now, our focus has really gone to Recycling Victoria and to providing quite sizable grants because of the change that's required in the industry capacity. You can see that our dots are getting bigger, and they're more focused on Recycling Victoria and on waste and resource recovery at the moment, as we strive to be able to close that circle on the tremendous challenge we have in our waste streams currently in Victoria. So I will leave that there, and thank you for your attention. A look at our new office. We're about to move to 321 Exhibition Street. We've just done a complete fit out of 2 floors, and talking about the engineering challenges of a sustainable fit out is probably another topic I'd like to pick up at some stage, but it hasn't been a smooth road. But hopefully one day you'll be able to come and visit the building at 321 Exhibition Street. We're trying to showcase sustainability in that fit out and the way that we operate that building.
Are there some examples in the picture you want to point out, Paul, of some of your recycled furniture or stuff?
Yeah, well, it's a lot of repurposed material actually, but a lot of the fit out is made from recycled product. I guess the key point that I would make, even though we've been able to achieve a lot, it's been very, very difficult to do it in a smooth way when you're doing a retrofit as compared to a new build. But I think that's a whole nother conversation.
I think it is, and I think we'd love to have you back for that, because one of the things I noticed the other day, I think Green Building Council were talking about it, where there's an organisation that basically tries to act as a kind of a brokerage between companies that are doing fit outs with their furniture and sort of green companies who want to use that kind of furniture. And I think more of that needs to go and happen. But Paul, thank you very much. That was excellent. And it's really encouraging to see. I mean, I think all of us will never forget the headlines that we saw. Is it 3 years ago when China stopped taking our stuff? And it was pretty horrendous at that stage. That I think we all were in this kind of happy feeling that, oh, we're okay. I put my stuff down in the recycling and it's all good. And there was a lot of people were very shocked to find out that the recycled plastic that was going into that thing was actually being shipped across to China. So I think congratulations for all the work that you are doing. It's not an easy task. There's a long way to go. And I really liked that diagram, which showed how far the circle has to come around. 91% on metals, and you can understand that, but only 14% on fabric. So lots and lots to do. A really visual way to do that. But thank you very much. You've filled the brief. Take the rest of the afternoon off. And I'm now going to hand over to our next speaker, my colleague Melissa Gaspari, coming all the way from sunny New South Wales.
Yes, it is sunny but cold and chilly still here.
Just like Victoria.
So I'll just confirm my screen is sharing.
Yes, live and in colour.
Excellent. Yep. Fantastic. Thank you, Jeff. So to give you a bit about me, I am a bit of a mixed bag, actually, a civil engineer who started working with local government, made my way through project management with Defence, and then onto the Australian Building Codes Board, where I helped change some of the National Construction Code around structural engineering. I'm not a structural engineer. Before turning to ESD and working with Lendlease across a few of their businesses, and then now working with Oricon as their sustainability lead in New South Wales and ACT. LCA is what I'm going to talk about a lot, and embodied carbon and how the two fit together. And it's something I got very interested in while I was at Lendlease. And at the time, they were investing quite a lot of time and energy into really understanding their environmental impact and their footprint using tools like LCA, as well as a host of other tools. Some of the approaches they've taken around carbon neutral construction, as a good example, have been based in the LCA data they collected. So if that's not a selling point for LCA, I'm not really sure what is. But I think LCA is a pretty amazing tool, and the lifecycle thinking approach that comes with it is something that we can all apply to a lot of areas we work in. So I'm going to come at this from, I guess, all of the perspectives: academic, designer, builder, and I kind of want to show a holistic view to this approach, because sometimes we can get stuck in the detail. So making sure my slides move across. Yes, perfect. The main goal of a life cycle assessment is to solve problems without creating new ones. So this essentially means we want to look at a project, we want to consider its whole impact over its whole life, and not shift that impact around, not just between the project, but from the choices we make today into choices for tomorrow. So if we go from the academic approach, according to ISO 14040 and ISO 14044, this is the formal sort of LCA process. You define a goal and scope, you assess a life cycle inventory, and you do a life cycle impact assessment. And at each of those stages, you interpret the results. What does that mean in English? That means we ask, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? What's our project? What are we looking at? Then we ask, okay, what's the steps in this process? What data do we have? Where is that data coming from? And then we look at, well, what are the impacts to this process and our project? And at each of the stages, we're constantly asking, all right, all this information is really awesome, but what does that actually mean? So in the built environment, it gets a little more structured, mostly because of how complex buildings are and all of the products that go in buildings. So to do a life cycle assessment for a building, you would go through this kind of staged process I have on the screen here. It's based on EN 15978 if you want to go jump into the standard. But essentially it starts from the pre-construction stage, then goes into the product stage, raw manufacturing and materials, the transport of those to other manufacturing and fabrication processes, the final manufacturing to create a product before then stepping into the construction phase, being transported to site, that on-site construction phase. At the end of that on-site construction phase, we kind of have a building and we move into the use phase. It's open, it's operating, we use energy, we use water, we create waste. We also have repair, replacement, refurbishment modes that we go through. And then in however many years' time, usually 60 years, we say, okay, cool, building's done, dusted, time to demolish, deconstruct, and go through a waste processing and disposal end of life stage. Then we've got this weird, cool thing that sits outside of our boundary of our project, which goes beyond the system. And that's really about sort of capturing the things that leave our project focus. So if you think about that in a building's context, the process from A to C on the screen would be a building from its inception, build up on site, construction, existing, and then demolition. When those materials move off site, you would go into the beyond the system boundary phase where they would become of economic value to the system somewhere else. One of Paul's slides in the very beginning showed that with the circles, with metals, that's a great example of a benefit from this beyond the boundary system, because things like steel have really high economic value and sometimes are cheaper using a recycled product than a virgin product. They can be looped back into our LCA, either our existing project or a new LCA, to show a benefit or a bit of a credit for our impact because we're using material over and over again. But this is kind of the very academic view. I like to chunk this down into something a bit more manageable. And then I kind of like to put it all together and show how it fits in. And I purposely use this kind of scribbled approach and to show, just because the embodied carbon phase or the upfront stage of the LCA looks small, we say, oh, it's the product manufacturing and then it gets on site and it happens once, doesn't mean it's not a complex process and doesn't mean it requires a lot of input. We always think that the operational phase of a building is the greatest focus. And yes, over a long period of time, absolutely. But we do the same thing in an operational phase that we don't do in the upfront phase. So in an operational phase, you turn the light on, you use energy. Where that energy comes from might change, but ultimately the process is very similar. When you think about every single product that goes into a building, into just a single assembly alone, there's a lot of processes that happen there. So take steel as the example. You go from iron ore extraction, and then you have transport to manufacturing processes. You may have a series of manufacturing processes and sometimes transport between those manufacturing processes. You may have fabrication processes on top of that, long before it makes its way to site. And we consider steel to be something that's fairly singular. When you consider something more complex, like a window assembly, that process starts to get really complicated and has a lot of impacts that were maybe unseen. So for a window example, a window assembly, you might have raw material extraction of plastics, of glass, of timber, of metals, and all of those things go through various transport, manufacturing, fabrication processes to create your end stage product. Now that end stage product appears at a gate. So what I've included in here, I don't know if you can see my mouse floating around there, is this line called the gate. Often when we talk about embodied carbon, we talk about cradle to gate, which usually refers to a product's retail or sale point or manufacturing point, where from that point, it would make its way to site. Sometimes people talk about embodied carbon and they include the construction phase. Sometimes they don't. It's a bit of a fluid definition. Neither are wrong, neither are right. They're both kind of in the same ballpark. But what we're talking about is all the stuff that happens before you get to a building, essentially. So this is the same for services. Let's jump into a building. What does that actually look like? I'm going to use an example here of a timber building first, and then jump into a bit more detail around a standard construction high-rise concrete building. So looking at the life cycle assessment for a timber building, now this isn't exactly Barangaroo International House, but it is based on something very similar to that. So those photos there are for your reference. But essentially, this is the breakdown of those phases: A, product manufacturing, construction, use, end of life. And you can see for a timber building, the majority of the impact comes from the operational energy use, and construction and the product stages start to interact with one another. If we look just into the product stage, so we're just looking at the products to get onto site to be installed, it starts to look a bit different for timber. Now that's because you've got an element of biogenic carbon happening. So the sequestered carbon in the timber itself is doing some fun things around giving you a benefit, which I'm going to leave for another discussion because we could spend a whole 20 minutes talking just about that alone. But essentially these two diagrams, the one on the left is your biogenic carbon, the one on your right is just without timber, to show you the impact of the products that appear when you look at that upfront embodied carbon stage of the building. And you'll notice in that right-hand diagram, the mechanical and hydraulic services account for 20% of the building's impact in the embodied carbon phase. Now that's right up there with glazing and reinforcement. So it's a pretty important topic. So I'm going to dive into a bit more detail on a standard concrete construction building because the breakdown looks a little bit different and lets us focus a bit more clearly on services. So this is based on the International Towers Sydney, and I'm sorry for the poor quality of those images. It's based on the high-rise nature of those buildings. So it's a high-rise concrete commercial building in Sydney. This is the breakdown of the life cycle assessment. You've got 25% attributed to the products, 65% to the operational energy, and then everything else in between. So there's your operational phase, your use phase. So use is your refurbishment, repair, maintenance. So this can kind of creep up on people when they're replacing products or maintaining products. This can increase and kind of sneak up on them. But we're going to focus in on the products phase. So the embodied carbon of a commercial high-rise concrete building breaks down a little bit like this. So you'll see almost 50% of concrete and reinforcement is structure. And then glazing and facade, services, and a whole bunch of your other fittings, fixtures, and finishes. So even in a construction case of a high-rise building, you're still looking at 10% for mechanical and hydraulics. Where are the other two services you say? Fire and electrical. They're in there, they just don't have, they're less than the 1% in this breakdown. And I'll show you why when I turn the slide over. So what are those kind of two parts of the pie graph made up of? The mechanical services are broken down into their material counterparts when we do a life cycle assessment. So that means that this table on the left here is all of the base materials that make up the services to fit in your mechanical, electrical, hydraulic, and fire. That means that we actually went through a building, we did a series of takeoffs, used the cost plan, the bill of quantities, and established at a benchmark level what the impact of a piece of cabling, an air duct, a cooler, a chiller was, and broke them down into their material quantities. Because at the fundamental level, an LCA looks at things based on their basic material makeups. So you can see the big hitters. Copper is a problematic material across all of the, sorry, not problematic, high impact material across all of the services. And then it varies between the different services, HDPE appearing a lot in hydraulics, less so in other services, PVC a lot more for electrical and fire, and mild steel in a lot of your ductwork and electrical, cable trays and the like. So this data is really hard to come by because services are complex. So this graphic, this slide is really just to explain, we all know that an individual service not only has a lot of complex and moving parts, each product within that service has a lot of complex and moving parts. And so the data to get that is the only, the data for that rather, is the only way we can build up to make a life cycle assessment. So I'm going from a very bottom up approach. And if you think about what I talked about with steel and window assemblies, it starts to get really complex really quickly with services, not to mention the individual types of services themselves and the individual products, but also the proprietary products that sit within there, where you have vertically integrated companies that will have specific processes just to produce their product, even though it might be equivalent to another product on the market. So where does the best data come from? Usually for life cycle assessment, environmental product declarations, because environmental product declarations do a couple of things. They are third-party reviewed and verified life cycle assessments of individual products. So they meet the standards of EN 15804, the ISO 1404 series, and product category rules. So product category rules basically sift products into neat little buckets so we can compare apples with apples. On top of that, they cover, oh, sorry, just jumped a slide. They cover a range of life cycle stages. So not only do they cover the embodied carbon, they cover the use phase, so in the case of, say, refrigerants, and they also cover the end of life phase, where some products actually have, buyback systems, recyclable process that they can go through. They'll be designed in such a way to be deconstructed and recycled. So some of those clear assumptions are made by the manufacturer of how you should dispose of their products, which enables really great data in life cycle assessment. What happens if you don't have an EPD? Because there are EPDs are a lot of effort to get to, and it's a very complex and detailed analysis. You get data, you get the calculation method, the basics basically. So this is a very bottom-up approach and can be based on an academic design or built data information. And the idea is that you take the total weight of a product, the proportion of a particular material in that product, and times that by that product's or materials emissions factor. So take something like a cable, the total weight of the copper within that cable, and might be, the total weight of the product might be, I don't know, a kilo. The proportion of copper in that cable might be 50%. The total weight therefore is 500 grams. And the emissions factor of copper might be, I don't know what it is. I should know off the top of my head. 1 kilo of CO2 per every 100 grams. That would give us our A1 impact for a product. The frustrating thing about this is that it requires us to do it for every stage of the life cycle. So we need to do it for the copper for a cable, for the plastic for that cable, for the transport, for the manufacturing process potentially, for the transport to the site, to the construction phase. It becomes a very, very large calculation. So it requires a lot of knowledge from a lot of different places and a lot of broad assumptions, because quite often we don't necessarily know the total weight of a product or the proportion of material that will be in that product. So what can we do as services engineers about this? The biggest one, and I should say, actually, I should pause and go back on that slide. The really good news about this stage is that CIBSE is working on a number of tools and guides around how to do this for products. So this calculation process and more complex versions of it are made available in a very standardized process, which is really great news. There are a lot of different versions of this, and a lot of the calculators like Green Star, ISCA are based on variations of this and EPDs put together. So the good news is that you don't have to figure out how to do this for yourself. There are tools and guides out there. But the big part about it, I guess, is my selling point of we need to ask for it, whether we're designers, builders, consultants, or clients. We need to demand that this data is made available. Often we talk to clients, and I know I talk to suppliers around, well, that's my commercial and confidence competitive edge kind of data. It's not really. Where the supply chain models are, and there are ways to protect that. We don't need, it down to the 20th decimal point gram of a material weight, but we need the general statistics so we can get an idea of how this data is making its way into our buildings, and then what we can do with that to put that material back into the economy to create a circular approach when we come to the end of life of our buildings. The other thing is to ensure that our analysis data assumptions are captured, understood, and we know exactly kind of what we're saying with them. And I point that out specifically is because I see a lot of people grab data from sources they've seen before, say, take a snapshot of my slide and call that truth. That's benchmark data off some assumptions Oricon have made around the clients and the buildings that they've worked on based off LCAs they've done before. That's true for those assumptions. It's not necessarily true for every assumption. There are some general rules of thumb that will follow suit, but ultimately we need to be very clear about what assumptions we make in this space so we can continue to make really good decisions. The other part is we need to cover a range of life cycle stages. I talked a bit here about embodied carbon, but there's end of life as well. There's operations. There's quite a lot of work being done in refrigerants at the moment around which refrigerants to choose, leakage rates, how we estimate that, and the embodied carbon of those, the carbon offsets, all of that kind of stuff. If we only know part of the story, we don't know exactly what we're deciding on and what we're putting in our buildings. And then start with the basics and then build up in complexity. I'm not going to pretend to be a services engineer and know how complex a service is, but I know what is required from a minimum, and I talk to the experts to ensure that I've covered the basics. When it comes to LCA, we want to be conservative, so it's okay to overestimate, because then we can make better improvements as we get more and more data in this space. I want to point out a couple of things just to summarize, I guess, my thoughts on this is that LCA is a really important tool to enable us to get a whole picture of a building. Services play a pretty big role. Once you move past structures, you're looking at services, glazing, and maybe one or two other large finishes. So services has a huge opportunity here, and services engineers have a huge opportunity here to really harness getting on top of the life cycle assessment approach, the embodied carbon approach, and make some real change. Like, every building needs services, whether you've got an electric building, a gas-fired building, you know, a residential building, commercial building. We rely on having services and having them operate well. So beyond energy efficiency of those services, we also need to think about smart, intelligent, and good design. Embodied carbon is half the story, and there are multiple definitions. So be conscious and ask questions around how exactly embodied and upfront carbon is defined. And it's not that any one definition is wrong, it's that we need to be clear about what part of the life cycle we're talking about. And I guess lastly is that data is important here. It doesn't need to be perfect, but we do need to know exactly where it's coming from. So I put it to you as services engineers to take on the life cycle challenge, ask for great data, and become the next life cycle assessment experts. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Melissa. That was terrific. Oh, just one thing I was going to do you think there are some opportunities? I mean, the whole thing about doing life cycle assessments is to really understand where there are the opportunities to have lower embodied carbon solutions. And have you seen, either in your work for Oricon or in your work for Lend-Lease, services engineers choosing lower embodied carbon alternatives?
I haven't seen them choosing lower embodied carbon alternatives. I have seen them really think about design and clash detection. So taking an extra step in design, which I'm sure we would all love to do all the time, that really looked at what materials they were using where and how they could reduce the overall quantity or volume that they were putting in buildings. So a little bit more refined design that really showcase the services rather than kind of treating them utilitarian-like and hidden behind, you know, access floors and ceilings.
Yep, that makes eminent sense. No, thank you for that. And thanks for your presentation. And we look forward to seeing you in Q&A time, question time.
Absolutely.
Now, last but absolutely not least, we have Monica.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak to you and the crew today. So I'm here to talk about the Materials and Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance. And I guess before I do that, I just wanted to touch base on the Science-Based Targets initiative, which is getting companies to focus on setting science-based aligned, Paris-aligned commitments around Scope 1, 2, and Scope 3. And the reason why I'm putting this slide up here and bringing us back to this, it was the conversation that I had with Frasers in 2018. They had set a science-based target, and as part of their Scope 3 obligations, they were starting to ring around their supply chain saying, you know, we want low embodied carbon concrete and steel, and there was nothing available in the marketplace. And, you know, when I heard that from them, I thought, we really need to find a way to try and address this. And we were talking to the New South Wales government as well at the end of 2019 with colleagues Ben Waters and Hudson Worsley from Precinct. They share an office in our building in Ultimo. And we got some money from the New South Wales government to undertake this report, which we launched last year. So we took a systems view of the building and construction industry and looked at where would those intervention points be, what are some of the barriers, and what could we do to accelerate the uptake. And this is our sort of systems map, if you like. I'm an ecologist, a social ecologist and an economist, and it's really that systems thinking lens that I like to bring to any of the problems that I'm seeking to solve. And you know, there are intervention points right across the supply chain in the different areas that are really important. So some of the areas we identified, the barriers, it's really complex. The building and construction industry, very complex. We know that to decarbonize some of these hard to decarbonize materials, there's investment that's going to be required. At the time, there wasn't really an awareness about this, and there wasn't that pull signal, that demand side signal, and probably a resistance to change. I'm sure you've all come across those. And we also realised how important the government is as a procurer. They, for tendering many of their projects, they're going to set the bar through their tenders, but also through policies, highly important, and the need for that coordination is also important as well. So we concluded that it would be great to have a coalition of organisations coming together. We originally thought it would be a buyers alliance, but thankfully we thought it would be good to bring the material suppliers, the engineers, the consultants to the table as well. At our same event, we'd been cooperating with Lend-Lease. Lend-Lease undertook a similar but different. They were going through their process of, they'd set a very ambitious absolute zero target, and they were looking at what are the barriers to the uptake of these materials for the focus on steel, concrete and aluminium. And one of the key messages was we have to start asking for low embodied materials, so that it becomes not just time, cost, quality, but that carbon becomes one of the decisions for these tenders and the process of constructing and building. So these are our members. We now have 113 members right across the supply chain. So, you've got your material suppliers all the way through to the constructors and architects and designers. And, we have the Green Building Council, Infrastructure Sustainability Council, many universities as well. And it's a do tank. If you've heard Hudson Worsley speak, we are a do tank. So here is the purpose of our alliance. We're very aligned, you can see, to the Paris Agreement targets and the principles of the circular economy. And these are the ways we go about achieving our work. Number one, that's that demand signal, really important. Number two, how do you actually define that best practice embodied carbon evaluation framework? EPDs, and there's some controversy around those benchmarking methodologies, the calculators and the inventories. How do you go about measuring that? Do you compare apples and apples? Knowledge sharing, very important. Common language, can we actually be a little bit prescriptive in the way we put language in to be asking for these materials without having unintended consequences? And then, the climate transition risks, obviously, and our supporting materials. So not just the big steel, concrete, aluminium, but also giving visibility to some of the innovative materials that are coming down the pipeline. And that's where the work of the Victorian Government, Sustainability Victoria, I think will be really interesting to explore. So those are our working groups. As I said, they're do tanks. We have about 20 to 35 people from those different organisations sort of peppered through these working groups. They meet about once a month, and then we have a governance in place, governance program in place to make sure that we're keeping on track to deliver. So I just wanted to give you some insights. You don't have to worry about the details here, but working group one on the demand side. So they've gone through a pretty extensive process of surveying to identify, well, what are the ways we're going to achieve that demand side signal? And identified, the policymaker and client toolkit is going to be really important. So the next process with the group will be to start developing that toolkit. We need to have disclosure measures in place, so requirement to measure and disclose. We know that Neighbours they've launched their process to look at embodied carbon in their Neighbours rating, which is really exciting. There's a consultation coming up on the 2nd and 3rd of December. they're going to be engaging in this area now. Show me how to deviate. So planning requirements, some incentives there, and then the pledge prerequisite as well. So those are some of the areas that our demand side group is going to be exploring over the next 12 months. Our evaluation team on those benchmarking tools. So again, don't be concerned about the detail, but a sense that they've been working very hard to identify what those methodologies are, the benchmarking calculators, and working through a discussion paper to then put it out to the community for feedback. We know that this is a behavioural change process in many ways, so we need to have case studies that showcase what is best practice, websites, and so on, to be able to educate all of us as we're on this journey together to address this, particularly around circular economy, which is probably still quite a new concept for many of us, and we certainly don't have the solutions to it. We run events. So our next spotlight event is going to be on steel, the decarbonisation of the steel industry. I'm happy to put a link in the chat if you're interested in attending. And our concrete and cement working group, they've undertaken a survey to look at, what are the key barriers to the uptake of lower carbon concrete and cement. We know standards are a particularly important issue, but so is the lack of knowledge, that perceived impact on the finished surface quality. As engineers, you're probably aware that there is some resistance to the use of some of the supplementary cementitious materials that can be included in an innovative concrete material product, and it's not necessarily always included in the tender evaluation. So trying to address some of those going to be important. So I just also hear, I think a couple of weeks ago, the concrete industry, they launched their decarbonisation roadmap. So you can see here right at the front, the red section, that's all about decarbonising the electricity supply chain. You've got innovation, the use of different kind of materials, the use of alternative fuels, and then right at the end, there's the carbon capture and usage technologies. So a lot of innovation opportunities for us to be able to employ the principles of circular economy into here. And, as I was preparing for this presentation and having a little look around to see, what actually is available in Australia, this Yarrabilla Bilba is a Lend-Lease project in the Redlands Shire, which is where my folks live. And this is the first, I think, Australia's first circular economy precinct. And, figure 73% of the waste sent to landfill could be reused in the circular economy. So it'll be very interesting to watch this project to roll out and see how they shift the behaviour, but also what kind of materials are used, what kind of challenges are undertaken and addressed there. And then, some of the others just sort of be able to give signals that things are changing. You've got the climate group and their Steel Zero. So these are companies, global companies that have said, we want to procure zero carbon steel. And they're really punching above their weight to drive that change. You've got the C40 Cities, Clean Construction Declaration. So, both Melbourne and Sydney are members of the C40 Cities. They haven't signed up to this declaration as yet, but I know they're working on it as they work through their process of addressing embodied carbon. They've got very ambitious targets, the declaration there. So this is a global declaration by the cities. They know they need to address this. They're looking for solutions, global solutions. That's exactly the kind of innovation opportunities for us to start to explore and export some of our smarts. And I wanted to also sort of showcase that we have a number of universities that are on board, and someone like Veena Saraswata from the University of New South Wales. I mean, she is just but one of the amazing materials academics who are part of our network in MECLA. And she was presenting at one of our working groups this week, and the Micro Factory. So they've taken mattresses, you can see mattresses left outside, scattered all over the streets. And instead of being sent to landfill, they've been taking these mattresses and taking some of them to Cootamundra to then repurpose them into ceramic materials that can be used. I think Mirvac is the partner on this particular project. So you've got a regional community repurposing these materials, refiguring them into something that can be deployed in our building industry. I think that's a really exciting beginning of starting to think about what we can do and how we repurpose. And the other thing that Veena spoke about the other day was that we can recycle pretty much everything. We have high quality polymers, we have the metals, we have the materials, we have the plastics that can be used and repurposed, that we have these high quality metals that can also be used for smart devices into our homes with 3D printers. And I think that it's an area of absolute opportunity for us. We don't need to be importing a lot of the polymers that come from plastic polymers from overseas that are very, very expensive. We could be driving down the costs here. So I'm really excited to see what's going to happen in this area, particularly around the principles of the circular economy, the rethinking. And as we've seen with our other speakers, you've got Sustainability Victoria as one example of a great organisation with the opportunity for government interventions, smart policies, those incentives to drive it. You've got Melissa and some of the showcasing work that's been done with a range of our professionals, and I think we're going to be seeing some really exciting opportunities coming down the pipeline as we address both the carbon issue but also the issue of our waste. All right, I'll stop there and we can open it up for questions and comments.
Thanks very much, Monica. That was terrific. Really, really good. And absolutely, I remember one of the first kind of presentations you gave a couple of years ago. I think Charles Rendix invited you to a particular event and I caught up with you, and how far things have gone. I mean, having attended pretty much every one of the events that you've put on, I've really take my hat off to you. Can I just, and we'll start getting into questions for everyone, if everyone could turn on their cameras, but just to go and ask you, how could some of the members of our members get involved with MECLA?
I left out my last slide, which had my contact details. As excited as I was. So I'll put in my email address in the chat and people can reach out. We're not taking any more founding partners at the moment, but people can come on, we'll include them on our email list, and I'm very, very happy to, we have regular events, and it's really about just building that capacity and education. So I'll do that now, Jeff. Thanks
very much. The other kind of aspect I was going to go and talk about is, so can I ask you, what does success look like for you in over a certain period of time? Well, when you're looking down, in a year's time, in 2 years' time, have you kind of defined what success is going to look like for MECLA and for the industry?
Yeah, well, I guess a couple of just practical examples that when the Queensland or the Australian Olympic Games in 2032 is showcased, and I think it's going to be a carbon neutral Olympic Games, that when it's assessed for how carbon neutral it is, that we've truly got the materials in place and the smarts in place, that we've been using when we're building the infrastructure, that we're able to source a lot of the embodied low and zero embodied materials. Any of the new commercial or residential buildings are actually using materials that are manufactured in Australia and have low, zero embodied carbon materials, and that we've actually created a whole new industry opportunity, particularly around the use of our, what's currently considered our waste stream, and we've turned the ship around.
Yeah, well, I think certainly if things go keep going that way, because I think there's a great opportunity to get there. I do think that sort of a lot of the folk who are on this in this presentation have been attending it have been on a kind of a journey that has really focused, I think, up until now on operational carbon. A lot of the, you know, getting services to be as efficient as possible and moving from you know, T5 to LED lighting, etc., etc., etc. You know, more efficient plant. But I think the embodied carbon story, a lot of folk, it was kind of probably in the too hard basket, too hard to manage, too hard to define those elements there. And but now, from what all the things I'm seeing, as we start decarbonizing our grid, the embodied energy is going to be more and more important. And tied in with that is that use of you know, recycling of things through the circular economy. So
one of the slides I didn't show, but the Think Step, ANZ and the Green Building Council, they launched a report recently that showed if we don't address embodied carbon, you know, what is now 16% of the building industry's emissions will end up by 2050 being 85%. So, you know, we can't afford, you know, the planet can't afford it. We can't allow that to happen. We have to be driving these ambitious commitments very quickly.
So I'm going to ask you a question that I asked Melissa in a previous, the Engineers Australia thing earlier on. And in fact, I asked the whole group. There was a whole bunch of super intelligent people and thinking, and I got a good answer on Melissa, but not out of many other folk. And the question I'm going to go and ask is, so how long is it before it's going to become, in your view and the kind of steps there, before people can start easily being able to go and say, you know, easily get low carbon concrete, easily get green steel, easily and cost effectively get you know, green aluminium? Do you all want to just maybe have a little bit of your comments on that? I mean, we're here now, and some of it's easy to do and some of it's not. And, you know, just your thoughts on what it will take to get there. Maybe.
Yeah, I'm happy to have a go at that. So on the concrete side, we've got at least 2 companies in Australia that are producing carbon neutral concrete that is in high demand. So, you know, they've got EPDs in place as well. So, you know, I think they're already on the journey. I know through the work, you know, through MECLA, that a number of the others are working through their processes at the moment. So easily, I reckon we're here. We've got, you know, geopolymer and other innovative concrete materials that are you know, using that supplementary cementitious materials to drive that. So, you know, I think that one has a longer way to go, but is solvable. Mm-hmm. On the steel side, that's probably a little bit more complex. You know, we've got BlueScope Steel and Rio Tinto have launched a project to develop a green hydrogen hub down in the Illawarra, and with a view to manufacturing green steel there. We've got, you know, people like Andrew Forrest and the resource majors starting to look very seriously at producing direct reduction iron pellets, so pig iron, as an alternative to exporting just the raw material to this region. And that's a very viable opportunity, I think, over the next 5 to 10 years. I know Andrew Forrest is very ambitious about this. I think Gladstone's going to be the world's largest source of electrolyzers. So, you know, this has all happened in the last 2 months. So things are moving very, very quickly. On the aluminium side, I mean, we can already secure low carbon aluminium from Europe. It's not available here in any large scale, and it's going to take some work to do that, and it's going to really be important for the buyers on the property sector who want to be using recycled and low carbon aluminium facades, for example, to send that signal down their supply chain and say, well, we want to establish long-term partnerships with companies that are willing to manufacture this. Rio Tinto, they've made a commitment to 100% renewables for their Tomago plant up in the Hunter Valley by 2029. So, things are shifting very, very quickly.
That's fantastic. Melissa or Paul, do you want to add to your thoughts on what are some of the barriers and, how do we move things along quickly in terms of being able to readily source lower embodied carbon materials?
Well, seeing Melissa's already given a good answer to this question, apparently, I'd like to hear that one. Yeah, look, it's really hard to predict. There's so many variables. I think Monica's given a great overview of the early opportunities and traction that's been achieved so far. But I do think this won't sound odd to anyone, that the key missing ingredient is government leadership in a lot of areas. We need that clear pathway for decarbonising the energy space, for one, so that people can factor that into their business making decisions. We need a government demand for products. I mean, I think in Victoria, from a recycled product perspective anyway, government's commitment to integrate requirements around recycled materials into the big build projects and associated major pieces of infrastructure obviously help iron out the pathway for some materials to make it to scale. But at the moment, I think we've got more case studies than we do have real transformative steps. So I see that we're in relatively early stages and need some strong government leadership to pull it forward.
And do you think there is that, Paul? I mean, you started that thing. Do you think there is that kind of leadership with respect to the big projects? I mean, there's going to be an enormous, there is an enormous construction infrastructure boom with, railways out to airports and new roads and new art centres and so on. But are you seeing that, I mean, or maybe a slightly different way, whose role is it to influence the specifications and the supply chains on that? I presume that SV has some kind of a lobbying thing, but not a kind of a responsibility around that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a unit set up in the Department of Transport called Ecologic. I don't know whether you've heard of that one or others, but Ecologic, really its focus is to develop standards and specifications for the sorts of materials, recycled materials, that could be used in the big build and other associated major infrastructure projects. They then work with the relevant government agencies, these are government projects, to, I guess, build their capability and confidence in using those specs in their big projects. They still have to get over that hurdle of convincing the project managers that this is a good thing to do. So, but they have made some great strides there for government-driven projects. But that's taken a really, they have to establish a particular business unit to focus on getting those specs developed and through. But they're doing some great stuff, actually, Ecologic. At SV, we're taking the work that they've done for the big build projects and translating those specs for local government purposes for their own infrastructure works, so that work can be translated to other areas of the industry.
And Melissa, I was going to ask you, I mean, I really enjoyed your presentation about life cycle assessment and taking it up. Would you like to talk a little bit about some of the tools that are available for doing life cycle assessments? And I suppose the other aspect to it is when can you see a situation whereby every single project that a consultancy does actually has a life cycle assessment done on every single project, as just as in the way that every project, goes through a quality system or, kind of checks and balances and things like that. There's a certain, if you like, methodology associated with that. Do you think we're there? And, for doing that, there's enough knowledge, enough fees, enough folk who know how to do it? Or what's it going to go and take for life cycle assessment to become, shall we say, BAU?
Yeah, I think that we are really getting there with life cycle assessment. It's not a term that is as scary as it once used to be. There are a lot of people who understand life cycle assessment, and embodied carbon is now almost a pseudonym for sustainability targets just generally. So I think right now there is a very strong push to do more life cycle assessment. The one thing I would say I see in that is that life cycle assessment is very much crap data in, crap data out. And, working groups like MECLA that we're part of enables getting really good data in for everybody to share, because this is not a problem we're going to solve individually, and there's no competitor or individual tool that's going to happen and do it all. It's something that we need to tackle together. And yes, someone just posted in the chat that Arup recently committed to doing whole life cycle carbon assessments for all of their building work. And that's the only caveat I would put on it, is that we absolutely can do it now. There's absolutely the intention, the tools available, the smarts available, the people available, the money available. It's just a matter of making sure the data is the right data and we're asking the right questions about that, because we can model, we're engineers, we can model and engineer and solutionize our way out of everything. But ultimately, if we don't choose smart data and we don't take the life cycle thinking approach and go, does this data make sense? Then, we'll just be in a world of strife later on with a whole bunch of information we don't really need.
So do you think, just building on what you were saying there, I mean, are, as part of engineering degrees now, are engineering students sort of regularly getting training with respect to life cycle assessment? Or is that something that comes when you come into the workforce?
I didn't get it as part of my engineering degree. I know a lot of process or industrial engineers get it. It's part of the sort of materials component to their degree. It's something that's very much focused on in the sustainability side of things, whether that's sustainable development or process engineering. It's something that we need to talk more about, absolutely, but it's also something that needs to have its basis in industry. When you look at it, I've seen a lot of really great academic analyses using life cycle assessment, using hybrid approaches, using economic input-output analysis, but that's unfortunately not real data. So what happens in a very theoretical space doesn't happen in industry, and sometimes that disconnect is a lot larger than people think it is. So absolutely we should be teaching it in engineering degrees, and I think everyone should get a taste of it to understand how it works. But at the same time, it's very much something that we need to put in practice and use as a tool in consulting when we get to the workforce, just like you would learn any other process in the workforce. You don't necessarily need a degree for that.
Sure. And I suppose another question to that is that obviously a lot of the kind of life cycle assessments and things get done oftentimes by consultants up front. A lot of sustainability consultants are doing this work. Can you talk a little bit from your experience, maybe working with Lend-Lease, as to how widespread the knowledge and thinking around life cycle assessment is now at the contracting stage of the building construction process?
Yeah, I mean, Lend-Lease is not alone in its approach. So to use them as the example, they are internally assessing their projects using life cycle assessment. using great EPD data, working with their suppliers to get that data and then to release it to industry. And they're using that as a basis to their scope 1, 2, and 3 sustainability emissions targets. So it's very much embedded in their process from the contractor. I guess what we're still seeing is it hasn't trickled down across all of the areas of project management, delivery, and procurement. So not everybody has a taste of it, I would say. So there are definitely large groups within Lendlease who have got LCA under their belt. They're using it as one of their main tools and they're disseminating that data. It hasn't necessarily made it to every development manager, every project manager, every procurement officer. So that is still a work in progress. And I'm seeing the same thing with clients like Mirvac and Built. There's a lot of people playing in this space. I mean, Monica, you're nodding, you're very much seeing the same thing. So contractors have cottoned onto this and they know what good data is too. So, you know, they're asking for the right things and consultants are having to step up to that and be engaged in the whole process and work alongside them, not just as a fee-for-service model anymore.
Can I just add to that as well? So it's not just the building constructors. So in the last couple of months, we've had financial institutions coming to knock on Mikla's door as well to say, we need to gather data because we're talking to the companies. We don't understand embodied carbon very well. We want to understand how do we assess your success if we're drafting sustainability linked loans, for example. How do we know what's a good target and how do we know how you're achieving that? So, you know, Australian Super, pretty big superannuation firm, really interested in this area. CIBSE, you know, very connected to the building and construction industry, and then Australian Ethical. So the ethical funds are coming, you know, they're just 3 examples. So I thought that would, you know, it's really interesting that the financial institutions are starting to move into this area as well.
Can I ask?
Absolutely. Because as people are asking for sustainable investments, they're using those tools, and so they want to know those questions and answers.
Last week I had the privilege of sitting in on looking at some fantastic talks associated with the Build Better Now initiative, which the UK Green Building Council ran associated with alongside COP26. And I sat in a fantastic presentation on kind of financing, you know, low carbon construction. One of the folk there was from one of the large developers there, landowners, Land Securities, and they were talking about the fact that they had a price of £80 a tonne for all of their developments that they were using for as a shadow price or a way of pricing theirs, you know, understanding the value of carbon there. Now, you know, carbon pricing is a very politically, strangely, a very politically charged term in Australia, which I think is rather silly, but do you think that well, first of all, do you think a carbon price will start coming in understanding that within the construction industry? Because I know folk like Lendlease are using shadow carbon prices and things like that. Do you think it will be helpful, and do you think that it will come? And I'd be interested in hearing from you all on this. Do you want to start, Melissa, seeing as Lendlease have certainly started on that journey?
Yeah, so the tools like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure are helping to speed this along a little bit, because when you are financially disclosing your climate impact and you want to talk about that, you need to be able to assign dollar values to things like carbon and environmental impact and social impact and the like. So I see it coming as the next wave, whether it is a voluntary or regulatory thing. I think the big competitors are playing in this space, you know, Microsoft and those guys, they're all in it and they're not shying away from it. I don't know that putting a dollar value on everything is always the right idea, but it's certainly a step in the right direction to make sure it's considered as part of the story. And I think we need to be ready for it. And I think we need to come to the table to be part of it.
Monica and Paul, do you have any views on whether a carbon price would assist or not with driving things along?
Well,
Yes.
I think the evidence is there that we know it has. It was the first time Australia, and the only time that we managed to reduce our emissions when we had the carbon pollution reduction scheme. So the evidence is definitely in, and I know many companies have a shadow price on carbon that they're utilising, and it comes down to the cost of capital as well, and the cost of offsets. If you want to be, net zero, the cost of offsets is going through the roof. So we're looking at somewhere in the order of over $100 a tonne. So that's it's a very expensive proposition. Companies are going to have a good incentive to want to drive their emissions down. So I think whether it will be black letter law or not, I think it is, it is a signal that is being utilised.
Paul?
Oh, look, yeah, heartily agree with both Melissa and Monica. It's just, it's a bit unavoidable, I think. And if government's not going to take us there, I think the private sector's already doing that.
Yeah, I think so. Can I encourage any of the members who are still on the call, and there's 19 people still in this meeting, that if you want to ask a question, don't be sitting around in half an hour's time saying, oh, I really wish I'd asked Paul that question because he's so knowledgeable.
Yes.
So please speak up now and ask a question. There is one I can see in there. Bruce Precious has just asked a question of you, Melissa. Do EPDs provide information on where materials are sourced from, e.g. new virgin material or recycled?
Yes, so EPDs generally show the manufacturing process for a particular product for a supplier. Sometimes suppliers won't be very clear about the percentage of virgin or recycled material they use, but it will appear sort of in their impact analysis. And if you head to, I'll put the link to EPD Australasia and EPD International that featured in my prezo in the chat. They have some great resources around what an EPD is, how to read an EPD, how to use EPDs, and how to sift through the information in there, because you have to remember that EPDs are a supplier's way of capturing the whole manufacturing process of their product to you, and sometimes the variations of their product. So they can be quite complex to sift through a large amount of data to give you a nice little embodied carbon number at the end. But yes, they do give you that information.
And are a lot of manufacturers now getting behind that and coming up with EPDs for their products?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing a lot more EPDs. We're seeing a lot more requests for EPDs as well, which is really great news. What's interesting is we're seeing a lot of use of international data in an Australian context, which is driving more Australian EPDs to kind of sort of compete with some of those international products as well. Monica, I'm sure you might have probably seen this as well. So they're definitely being used as a great tool, as a marker for efficient product manufacture, that's for sure.
What it doesn't do, because it's quite expensive to go through the process, it doesn't provide an easy way for the innovative materials, the materials that are reusing some of the things coming through our waste stream. It doesn't find an easy way for them to do it at a cost effective. So it'll be really important for us as we move through this journey to find ways to make it more cost effective for the innovative materials, so that the engineers who want to be specifying and working with these innovative materials have a way of comparing those different products.
Thanks. Tim Bush has asked a question. Anyone on the panel, is there any industry groupings of building services suppliers and manufacturers who are working together to get more low carbon and high recycled content building services products onto the market? Are you aware of anyone yet?
I think it's a good question. Probably the answer is no one at this stage. But ASBEC, so the industry association that you're a part of, ASBEC is starting to look into this area. And, you know, so is MECLA. So, you know, we're kind of working together to try and drive some of these opportunities forward.
Yeah, look, I think it's a great question, Tim. And, you know, one of the things that I think that we, you know, I'd like CIBSE and others to get behind is, you know, what about, if we think fundamentally about what it takes to put together a building, you know what I mean, from a building services point of view, you know, where are our, you know, green steel ductwork? You know, where's that? I want to go and get zero carbon ductwork. You know, it's been offset, good manufacturing process. Where do I get that from? You know, that's the first thing. I want to be able to go and get a, you know, similarly, the things that are built up like air handling units. You know, where's the green offset and green manufactured air handling units? Copper. I mean, we spoke about copper earlier. What you know, what kind of processes are happening there? So, I do think that some of the my reading is that some of the, if you like, civil and structural components of the industry are perhaps further along in their thinking along the curve at the moment. And one would argue that because that's where the highest embodied energy is, that's a good thing. But I do think this meeting was a little bit of a call to arms for the building services sector to start us thinking and asking about that. And Melissa, you spoke earlier about some work that CIBSE were doing in this space. Do you want to just talk about that very, very briefly?
Yeah, so they're putting together a guide on how to calculate the embodied carbon of services using a similar basic calculation method that I showed in my presentation, as well as more complex methods. So I'm not sure if that or when that's going to be publicly released, but that's a great tool to kind of give all of the services engineers arms and knowledge around how to do that. This is very much a call to action kind of space. The services are complex in nature, and I think we need to acknowledge that. There's a reason that we've focused on concrete and steel and timber, is because they're pretty well known and simple products by comparison. If you think about all of the little bits of material that would go into, you know, a fan compared to a piece of concrete, it's a very different kettle of fish. So I think that's something to definitely put into context in that space, that services have a much harder kind of hurdle to jump over to get through this, that's for sure.
Well, look, I'm conscious it's 7:39 and you've been giving up your time to provide all of this information. I'm going to kind of give a last call for folk who want to ask a question to ask away. And just as that I asked, Joel Cox has asked a quick question, which I will do. I think we'll ask that, and then you know, if somebody else wants to ask another question, they better be pretty quick, because I think otherwise we'll wind up the meeting and let you go and enjoy the rest of your evenings. But so Joel Cox asks, with the material Melissa just described, will there be targets available to identify if the product being specified meets criteria?
Not to my knowledge. The first task is just getting the data at the moment and understanding it before then establishing a target, because even the data I showed has quite a bit of variability in it, because it's based on takeoffs, bill of quantities. It's assuming, you know, an assumption for a standard product where that will vary between all of the different sizes, variations, proprietary supplier products. So not at this stage, but that's definitely the next step. And the first step, I would say, if you're interested in that, is looking at percentage reductions from a benchmark, because that's always a way to start tracking in the right direction if we don't have good benchmark data to go from. Okay,
that's great. And look, I will ask one question just to finalize everyone on this one, and that's to go and say it's that kind of you know, positive negative thing. So maybe you could all just give me what frustrates you most about Australia's progress towards a circular economy, and then to end as a positive thing, what gives you optimism that we'll get there and get there soon? Maybe Monica, we start with you on that one.
Thank you, Jeff. What frustrates me around circular economy? Well, we can achieve 40% of our climate targets if we actually deploy the proper principles of the circular economy. So we're on that journey. We do need to have leadership. We've committed to net zero, and you know, we just have to see it as the biggest opportunity that we can to drive new jobs, new industries for Australia, and to look after nature and the planet. So I get a little frustrated, I have to say, that we still seem to play a lot of politics in this area. Big sigh. And what gives me optimism? I have been so inspired and heartened by the work that I've done with the people, you know, very practical, you know, MECLA people coming on board in this do tank and just rolling up their sleeves. It's all, you know, sweat labor, all in addition to their daily work, and that people really want to solve some of these problems. And I'm talking about government agencies, private sector, industry associations, and really sort of coming together to solve these really complex issues. So that's what gives me optimism. Thanks.
That's a great answer. Paul, your thoughts. What you know, you're sitting there and you're thinking, oh, if only. What frustrates you about our progress in the circular economy, and what gives you optimism?
Oh, look, I still I have to agree with Monica. Politics is probably the most frustrating thing that interferes with progress in this space. I think jurisdictions are doing great work. It's not coordinated, and it's not necessarily in harmony with what the Commonwealth are doing, and that sets us back quite a way. So that's the most frustrating thing from my perspective. The thing that gives me hope, I've only been in this space for probably 18 months or so, 2 years, but the exciting projects that I see coming through are just inspirational. People are really innovative. They've got really deep knowledge and understanding and drive and commitment. All the right ingredients are there to really build an economy on this. And yeah, the frustrating thing is that some of our policies don't seem to recognise that.
Thanks, Paul. And finally, Melissa, to you, what frustrates you about our progress in the circular economy, and what gives you optimism?
I think I'm only echoing the sentiments of Monica and Paul, really, but you know, it would be great to. My frustration is that, you know, we have no national leadership on this issue in any way, shape, or form, in any variant of it, which is disappointing for Australia, because I think we, you know, are a nation that is quite innovative, but it's a shame that there's no real great leadership setting us a long-term agenda. And the most positive is, you know, like Monica said, everybody that I talk to from MECLA or work with, you know, there is such a groundswell of movement in doers who have such deep expertise and knowledge, who are willing to share and help. And every time I talk to somebody, it's like, oh, yep, we need to get on that. We need to do this. And, you know, I wish there were more hours in my day to be able to do that. So that's really heartwarming, and it keeps you going.
Well, look, let's end on a high note. And look, on behalf of the CIBSE committee, I sincerely thank all three of you for giving up your time and for really sharing a lot of knowledge to our members. And I do encourage any folk who want to learn more about that, get involved in MECLA. It's a great thing. Maybe we need, Monica, a building services work stream. I mean, maybe that's, I know there's a lot on, but I mean, if we got enough folk there, I'd rather, you know, that kind of happens with the kind of support system that MECLA gives than, say, individual organization like CIBSE kind of, you know, trying to battle it alone, because I think you have a good ecosystem, shall we say. So that was unrehearsed, and you might say, poke my eyes out later on, but
I promise I won't. Yeah, no, come along, come and find out. Let's have a conversation and see where people fit into the ecosystem, for sure. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. And thanks very much to everyone. And thanks to all the members who've given up their time. I hope you found it useful, and feel free to give us feedback on this subject. And if you need any kind of connections to things, to some of the folk on the call, we can certainly help on that. Have a great evening, and thank you again. See you soon.
Bye.
Thanks all.
Thanks,
See you
everyone.
all.